Won't take long to get you up to speed. What we're going to do in this workshop is build upon what we did in the first one, which was essentially converting job postings and job descriptions to be skills-based instead of credential-based and pedigree-based. That's the nutshell of it. And in this workshop 2, we build upon that by now evaluating candidates using that same criteria. And then when it comes to workshop 3, which I think will be in about 3 weeks, I haven't set an exact date for it, but you'll be invited. We will then take the criteria that we developed today and then use it to actually choose our candidates and set them on a path for success within the company, looking at best practices for onboarding. And then the final one, and I think probably the one that's going to resonate the most with most people is retention. So when I worked in HR, I was primarily talent acquisition for a call center. And you may know that call centers are notorious for turnover. And so when I worked in HR for a call center on the north side of Indy, I would do a new hire class of 20 to 30 people every quarter. 3 months later, half of them would be gone. It was just pouring water into a leaky bucket. So we're really going to try to look at how to keep good people once we've gone to the trouble of attracting the right talent, using a skills-based approach, evaluating them and selecting them and onboarding, and we've got all this time and money invested. You all know it's a lot cheaper to keep the employees you have than to hire new ones. So that's where we are. We already did the poll. Skills-based hiring. So for those of you who were here last time, let me give you a pop quiz. Do you happen to remember any of those key components? Like, what is skills-based hiring? What are there's 3 things. Does anybody remember any of them? You can share in the chat, or you could, this is a small group, you can unmute as well and just speak up. We could be very informal today. Does anybody remember anything about the 3 items from skills-based hiring? Anybody? Okay. All right. Well, the first one, I kind of hinted at this already, but removing credential requirements. This is not always possible. There are jobs that have to have a license or a credential, but wherever possible, we're going to shift to competencies in skills-based hiring. KSAs, knowledge, skills, abilities. Sally says reduce bias. Absolutely. That is one of the 3 key. I'm just going to go and put all 3 on the screen right now. So reducing bias, absolutely. And in workshop 1, we talked about how it's not always intentional bias. Sometimes it's just kind of inherent, passive bias that the person committing the bias may not even totally intend it or understand that they're doing that. And then using the right competencies for the job, competencies specific to the job. So those are our 3 keys to skills-based hiring. So again, you are in workshop 2, but it is a 4-part series. And if you're jumping in now, that's great. 3 and 4 will definitely be of more help to you. So we hope to see you come back. So the objectives for today are to take the skills-based approach and apply that towards wading through the sea of resumes that come in and adapting best practices in the evaluation process. Screening candidates for competencies instead of credentials, and writing skills-based interview questions and assessments. So that's the objective today, is to develop some methods for taking the competency-based approach that we learned in workshop 1 and actually using it to screen candidates and make sure that we've got the best talent for the job while casting the widest net possible. So we're going to challenge some common approaches to interview questions. We will discuss how to integrate assessments to improve our ability to ensure candidates have the right competencies. And of course, like Sally pointed out, reducing interviewer bias to determine the best candidate to hire. So let me give you another poll question here. How much time do you think the average HR person spends looking at one resume? What kind of shot do you have if you manage to get a pair of eyes on your resume? How much time are they spending looking at that resume? All right, the results are in. We got, I'll just go ahead and share those. One person says 0 to 15 seconds. A couple people say 16 to 30. A couple more people say 31 to 60 seconds. When I was in HR, I always tried really hard to give 1 minute. Sometimes I would even have the timer on my iPhone and be like, you have to look at this for 1 minute, because there were days where I would go through 200 resumes easy. So I'm a skimmer by nature. I tend to kind of skim through and then maybe go back and read. I always try to do 1 minute, but you would be surprised that the most common answer from SHRM studies is 8 seconds. 8 seconds. The HR folks typically spend reviewing one resume. I feel this. Again, having looked at 10,000 resumes, I understand. So what are the consequences of spending so little time on a resume? Anyone want to share why that might be a bad thing for resumes to get such little attention? And again, you can chat, or you can feel free to unmute and talk too. It's a small group.
Maybe you rely on like familiar markers, like those credentials you're trying to get rid of in order to signify if a resume is worth spending more time on or not.
Yeah, that is a big one. Like I said, in skimming, you're going to look for keywords. And if the person puts that keyword on, not necessarily without even having the skill, the competency that you're looking for, that might push them up the flagpole, and if they're missing certain keywords, might drop them down. So let's do a little exercise here. So I'm going to give you guys, well, I'll give you more than 8 seconds. I'll give you 15 seconds per resume. So I'm going to get my timer up here. I'm going to show you 2 resumes, and then I'll give you 15 seconds, and you tell me, and then we're going to ask you if you would interview this person. Okay, so here we go. Here's the next one. I'm starting the clock. Go. 15 seconds. Five seconds. Okay, and stop. Here is the second resume for recruiter. So these people are applying for recruiter. Here are their 2 resumes. I'm resetting the 15-second clock. Five seconds. And stop. So in that limited amount of time that you had, let me launch a new poll. Would you interview candidate 1? Would you interview candidate 2? Would you interview both of them, or would you interview neither of them?
What's the position, Chad, that I'm
Recruiter.
interviewing for?
Recruiter.
A recruiter.
Yep. Okay, so let me share with you the poll results. So the majority said I would interview candidate 1. And then a couple other people said that they would interview both. Nobody said that they would interview only candidate 2. So this is super interesting. This is super interesting because we're actually going to touch on something that Lauren just brought up, that first resume had that word recruiter on there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the correct skills for the job that we're hiring for. So let's zoom out for just a second. Skills-based hiring, why do it? Because number one reason is that education is not always a guarantee of skills. And I'll give an example from my own life. I graduated with a degree in journalism, went to work right out of college in a newsroom as a reporter, and found that my experience on the job was a million times more educational than the actual degree that I got. I was not at all prepared for the job that I got out of college, even though I got that job based on having that title on my resume that I had that degree. So competencies are the best indicator to determine the best fit for a role. Up to 5 times better than education and 2.5 times better than work experience. But the same study showed that developing evaluation processes, so what we're doing today for those competencies, are crucial to actually making those skills work. So traditional screening, as Lauren said earlier, is often based on credentials, looking at degrees, work experience, to screen out candidates who don't meet certain requirements. We always, in the talent acquisition department that I worked at, when I first started there was a hard requirement that you had to have 1 year of customer service experience, as if 364 days of customer service experience was really any different than 365, right? So using numbers and degrees and years of experience it isn't always the best way to do it. Those are credential-based or pedigree-based screenings. They can also include unintentional bias. So if you're looking at a resume that looks at just titles, and people often do that when they have very little time to screen resumes. They're looking at the applicants' names, their titles, the name of the school they went to, their level of education, even zip codes. So I worked in an HR department where there was only 7 zip codes in the town, and one of them was the wrong side of the tracks, right? Like the bad side of town. And so if a resume came in that had that zip code on it, I believe that created bias among the people who are screening those applications, that might be a red flag for no good reason. A person's zip code obviously has nothing to do with whether or not they have the skills for the job or not. So that's what we're focusing on, is skills-based screening, using the competencies that we developed in stage 1, and then actually putting them into practice to review resumes for evidence that candidates actually have the required competencies. So work experience and education, they are only used to demonstrate, they typically, people assume that they demonstrate the attainment of certain required competencies. That's not always true. My dad always told me, college is what you make it, right? You can party your way through college and just barely graduate and not really know anything. You might have someone else who is, studying, hitting the books constantly and really leveraging that experience. So we're not going to look at a college degree as necessarily a guarantee that you've got the skills that I need for the job that I'm hiring for. So we're going to mitigate that instinct-based decision-making and work towards validating competencies. So that's what we're doing today. So this would be a good time to, one more recap from workshop 1. So for those of you who are not at workshop 1, what you see on the screen right here, these are the 5 required competencies that we chose in workshop 1 for the position of recruiter. So following up on Scott's question, we're going to be using the position of recruiter as the example for the next hour. So these are the 5 required competencies that we want to see in our recruiter applicants, each one defined by how the competency applies to the recruiter's duties. So you can find the full job description on page 7 of the participant guide that I sent. We've already overhauled it from credential-based to skills-based. So when we first opened that job description in workshop 1, it said things like, degree in human resources, experience with UltiPro, like a specific applicant tracking system, certain number of years experience in this field. Again, those things, for me personally, all 3 of those things might have screened me out when I was applying for an HR job at that career pivot that I told you about. Fortunately, I found my way to a company that was taking a skills-based approach, and they recognized that in the 13 years that I had worked at my radio station, that I did indeed learn a whole bunch of HR skills. Even though I didn't have an HR degree or any certifications or have any familiarity with an applicant tracking system, I had essentially done the work of a recruiter and of an HR manager for many years. So using job descriptions for screenings, this is really important that we only remove candidates that do not have the required competencies. So when we're screening, before we get to the interview process, that first level of screening, when we're doing pre-screening and we're doing resume, that's early in the process, we should only focus on required competencies. And when we put a competency into a job description, we define it using this template that you see at the bottom, that they're going to blank to blank to blank. They're going to do something to achieve something. This is a template that we provided in workshop 1. And so you can see up above where it says required competencies, we have defined those using that template structure. So for example, you see judgment and decision making. That is, you have to have that competency to be a recruiter. So what are you going to do? You're going to assess. What are you going to assess? Eligibility and qualifications to achieve what outcome? To choose new hires. So you can see that we followed this template here. That's really important, that the competencies are defined using that formula. Do something to achieve something. So looking at these, take a moment to look at these required competencies, because these are the 5 key KSAs, knowledge, skills, abilities, that we cannot budge on for this position. Now we have some preferred competencies too. And we're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of the session today, because as we get near the end of the hiring process, we want to start basing our screening on the preferred competencies. Because as we get through the hiring process, we're already weeding out people who don't have our required competencies. So near the end, all that's left are people that do have the required competencies. Now we can start to screen them in instead of screening them out, by screening based on the preferred competencies. So all said, we have 8 competencies that we chose in workshop 1 for recruiter. And then we defined them using this, basically this word equation: do something to achieve something. But again, we are only going to focus right now, early in the process, on required competencies. Number 1 being interview and assessment techniques. Number 2 being process improvement. And these are actually ranked. So this might be a good time to go ahead and open the spreadsheet that I sent you, because we are going to actually do this now. We're going to use a screening guide to focus in on the required competencies for the job. That way, when anyone on a hiring team is making judgments about a candidate's resume, they're evaluating them for what's needed for the job. So reducing bias in terms of someone's opinion about whether a candidate is good for the job or, a good fit. And again, some of this bias is intentional, some of it is unintentional. Did you know that ethnic names on resumes tend to be one form of bias? And this can be intentional, obviously, but also can be unintentional too. So a candidate named Jamal might need much more experience on a resume than a candidate named Greg for a certain screener, a certain talent acquisition person to actually call them in for an interview. So if we stop using criteria of good fit and start looking at competencies, does the candidate have that interview and assessment skill? Then hiring teams are going to make much better judgments on the candidates, and they're going to reduce the bias. So I'm going to switch now from sharing that screen to, I'm going to share the spreadsheet. So you guys should all have this on your computer as well. So let me go ahead and share the version that I have.
Chad, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
This might seem a little like unrelated to what we're talking about, but you're talking about this idea of switching from thinking about whether somebody is like a good fit based on incredibly subjective, like, you know, measures to whether or not they have the skills to do the job. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think that, I mean, depending on the environment that you're hiring for, there is sort of an element of cultural fit, I guess. And you could have someone who has the skills and the competencies to do the job, but who may not actually fit particularly well within the culture of your organization. Is that something that you can balance with this somehow?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think actually we're going to touch on that a little bit later, because what I have found, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there, you know, workplaces do have culture, and it's important that that you can be a part of that culture. What I'm trying to do when I talk to employers is to stop looking at whether someone fits the culture you already have, and turn that paradigm around to think about whether that person brings something new to the culture, and whether they can diversify and enrich the culture and expand the culture at your workplace, rather than fitting into a culture you've already defined. Can we expand the culture itself? And so instead of looking at someone as being different and not fitting in, what benefit could a workplace have by bringing that person in and expanding or redefining the culture with them included in it? That I know that might be
that's actually a great answer.
It might be a little naive. I mean, I know that's a little naive what I'm saying, but when you look at really progressive workplaces, like, they get that idea. They get that idea is that culture is an evolving thing, and that it actually gets better with people who are different from you. And this is true on my own team, you guys. So we've done a bunch of the like behavioral assessments and stuff on my like team building exercises on the team that I have. There's 15 people on my team, and you know, we've done like the Myers-Briggs and all that kind of stuff. And what I have found is the two people that I interact most with on my team are complete opposites of me in terms of Myers-Briggs, and really just how our brains work and how, you know, how we function. And those folks enrich me so much. Like and one of them is my direct supervisor, Keisha, who always knows the exact thing that I'm missing. Like, if I'm stumbling on a problem, I'm looking at it from a certain way. She's like, well, have you looked at it like this? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. I didn't even think of it that way. And so it's like, I gain so much, you know, from my teammates who are completely different from me, who are maybe introverts instead of my extrovertedness, and that have different qualities from me. Like, we complement each other so well. And I think our culture grows, you know, because of that. So here is the spreadsheet that I sent you guys. So this is the exact same thing that I emailed. So right now you see, this is what we did in workshop 1. So we actually had 11 competencies that we came up with, and then we ranked them. We discussed whether they're occupational or foundational. So those are just new terms for hard skills and soft skills. So occupational skills are hard skills, foundational or soft skills. These are just new terms that are a little bit more inclusive than hard and soft. Can we train them? Are they required or preferred? And then finally, this was the last step we did. We wrote, using that formula that I showed you guys, we wrote definitions for the top 8 competencies. We ended up dropping these last 3, and we focused on just these 8 competencies. So these are the 8 competencies that we're going to use to reinvent the rest of the hiring process. So this is the foundation that we will keep coming back to in all parts of this. In particular, these top 5, which we have to screen for up front, and then later in the process, we will try to use these preferred ones to differentiate a little bit from candidates that we know hit the base criteria. So on our PowerPoint here, I don't know that we really need to do breakout groups. I mean, there's only 6 of us here. I'm sure that we can get through this a lot faster if we just stay in the same group. So if it's all the same to you guys, why don't we just kind of talk through this as a small group? We're already in a small group here. So the first thing that we have to do is go to tab 2 on the spreadsheet and copy over the 5 required competencies. So on your spreadsheet, go to tab 2, which is screening guide. So I'm going to copy those top 5 competencies from tab 1. And I'm going to paste those into tab 2. So I'm on tab 2 of the spreadsheet. It's called screening guide. And we don't have all the rest of these candidates. So we're just looking at candidate 1 and 2. So those 2 resumes that I showed you, we are going to assess whether or not they have these skills. There's a drop down here. So the answers are yes, no, or maybe. Now here I've got a version on my screen that has those 2 resumes so that you guys don't have to flip back and forth. And I know this is a little bit small. So tell me, candidate 1, is it clear from the resume whether or not candidate 1 has the competency of interview and assessment? Does the resume demonstrate that they have interviewed people and assessed those applicants based on that interview? So the answers are yes, no, or maybe. What do you think?
Maybe.
Maybe. Yep. I would say it's not clear. And notice candidate resume 1 is the one who calls themselves a recruiter, right? But I don't see, I mean, maybe they've done it, but it doesn't say.
I'm going to say no, maybe to no.
Yeah, I might go that direction too, Scott, because it looks like their position in reality, even though it's called recruiter, was really more of a campus relations person, where they were, setting up information booths and talking to people and designing materials, but not necessarily interviewing anyone or assessing them. Okay, staying on candidate 1, process improvement. Do you see anything on the resume that says that they have improved a process? Remember, these are our top 5 required competencies for this recruiter position.
I think maybe, like if I'm being generous, you could maybe assume that as part of their work in making these presentations to high school students, that they have spent some time thinking about improving what that looks like and, thinking about their outreach approaches. So like maybe, but it's not explicitly stated.
Yeah.
I'm saying no. No,
Yeah, I think again, we are either a maybe or a no. And there's no right or wrong answer here, guys. I mean, obviously this is subjective. We are just trying to create some standards to make this as unsubjective as possible, as objective as possible. Interpersonal skills. I mean, I think this one, I mean, I would guess yes on this.
yeah, I'm giving it a yes.
Yeah, I mean, their whole job is going and talking to people, right? Doing tours, chatting with people at events, manning information tables. So yeah, if I was sure about candidate one in any of these 5 key competencies, it would be that first one, interpersonal skills. So I'm going to go ahead and say
Yeah, it
yes on
says
that.
convince students that programs are a good fit. I mean, to convince somebody, you've got to have those skills.
Yeah. Okay. So see, that might come into play later too, Scott, because that's persuasion, which is one of our preferred competencies. We're not screening for that yet, but if this candidate makes it past those initial reviews, then that persuasion might help them later in the process, being that that's a preferred competency. What about judgment and decision making? Do you feel from resume 1 that this person has to judge things and make decisions based on those judgments?
No,
I don't see anything clearly that says that. I mean, again, like Sam was saying before, I think you might infer some of that based on it, but it's not clear. It's not clear from the resume. Now, from writing, what do you think about writing?
design and create marketing materials with writing.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and give them a yes on it. Now, I would like to see some of those materials. So that's maybe where we talk about work samples, which is something that we're going to get into here in a minute. But from the resume, I'm looking at no, maybe, yes, no, yes. So think about that for a second. This is a person who's putting themselves forward as a recruiter. They've got that word recruiter in their summary, right? But we've got a no's or maybes for 3 out of 5 of the required competencies for our recruiter position. So this is one of those situations where maybe candidate 1 isn't as good as the title of recruiter suggests. Let's look at the other one now, candidate 2. So this person is clearly a logistics person, right? Like this is someone who's like in the warehouse, like, you know, doing the work of the operations flow. Interview and assessment. I see one little thing on this resume that might suggest that. Do you guys see that?
They hired and trained, so.
Yeah. So they did, right, you're right on, Sally. So they didn't do a very good job of saying that they've interviewed and assessed candidates. But if they hired 25 new employees per quarter, there must have been some interviewing and assessment in there. So if I give them the benefit of the doubt, even though they're not very good at expressing that on their resume, I would say, yeah, there's a real good chance that they have done that. What about process improvement?
Coordinate warehouse teams to meet daily goals. You're doing daily goals. That's all about process improvement.
And the second bullet says evaluate process to support customer service and operational goals.
Oh yeah, it totally does. Yeah, it totally does. And even below that, identify and implement improvement opportunity. Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a yes for process improvement. It's a different set of processes maybe, but the basic competency, which is really hard to teach because it's a soft skill, meaning it is foundational, not occupational, really hard to teach someone how to improve processes in general. So if they have that competency of being able to improve a process, maybe they can apply that to the experience of being a recruiter and improve those processes too. I'm going to give them a yes on that. What about interpersonal skills? Are you seeing anything in here that indicates that they're good, like talking to people and anything like that?
Again, a coordinated warehouse teams to meet daily goals. You've got to communicate that, what your daily goals are.
Yeah, so I'm going to call that a maybe, because
Well, and this poor person is also responsible for writing responses to customer complaints, which
oh,
feels
okay.
like
Yeah.
actually that's a pretty significant interpersonal skills. I mean, if he was bad at that, he probably wouldn't still be in this job.
Right.
And at the bottom, it says that they worked a phone bank and door knocked over 500 families.
Okay. All right. So I'm hearing maybe we upgrade. I was going to give it a maybe, but maybe we upgrade that to a yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. That's a good catch, Lauren, because that came out of his volunteer work.
Yeah. Judgment and decision making. What do you think about that? I mean, reduced operating budget by 15%.
Identify and implement supply chain improvement opportunities. You got to be able to judge what those opportunities are and implement them.
Yeah, so judgment, decision making, and then also process improvement seem maybe like they're kind of related. I
Yeah.
would say give them definitely a maybe. And then finally, writing. So as Sam pointed out, this person has wrote responses to customer complaints. We don't know what they look like. We don't know if they're good or not. But as she said, we can assume, if he still has that job and he did it for almost 4 years, that he was probably good at that. So the point is, look at these two resumes now. Now that we've screened these, and look at the list of responses that we've got. Once we use the competencies to screen these. So let me
set that up, didn't you? Set that up, Chad. Yeah,
right.
so the competencies for the guy that we didn't pick from the beginning, because we're looking at the other.
Yeah, so let me ask
credentials.
You, so this is our final poll for today. So let me ask you again. So now that you see this checklist, tell me again, refresh your opinion. Would you interview candidate 1? Would you interview candidate 2? Would you interview both or neither? And you'll see now from the responses, let me share the responses with you. You'll now see that candidate 2 is at least going to get an interview. It may not go any farther than that, but now candidate 1 doesn't look so good when we focus on the competencies instead of keywords. And candidate 2 at least has a fighting chance. I don't know that they're going to end up being able to do it, but they now have a fighting chance because of a competency-based approach. So great exercise. Thank you so much. We're past that poll question. So again, screening. Let's talk about pre-screening assessments. So that is a complement to resume review. So resume review is what we just did. Pre-screening assessments are going to give us a better view of specific required competencies. So these happen at the same time as resume review, or right before or right after, a lot of times during the applicant process. And these should be super quick. So pre-screening shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to complete, and should not create any additional barriers. They should be short and simple. So again, we're moving away from just what I think about a candidate, moving towards exact competencies that are demonstrated skills for the job. So that's going to reduce bias. That's going to give us more insight, and it's going to help us compare candidates' performances more easily. So for recruiter, what are some pre-screening assessments that we could do for a recruiter? So has anyone used any pre-screening assessments? Like maybe something that I'll ask maybe Bianca or Sally. Have you what sort of pre-screening assessments have you seen out there?
I mean,
Well, in the warehousing, in the warehousing business, when we would hire forklift operators, we always had some sort of a math test.
Yeah.
So, so they know how to count and, figure out how many cases per pallet and how many pallets then would be on an order. So we had some sort of a math test for them.
Okay.
If that's what is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Yeah, I heard someone else about to jump in too.
Sally, it's interesting, Walmart has a really interesting process in it. They have sort of a combination culture kind of assessment that is done for every employee, regardless if it's salary or hourly. And then based on the job you do, it'll layer on another assessment, like, for example, like he was saying, math for certain jobs and so forth. But typically for salary, every once in a while, companies will do something like Myers-Briggs or something, which is really illegal.
Right. Yeah.
So, those personality ones really aren't legal to do. But
right.
for a salary kind of job, which this is, you'll find some employers use that. I typically, back when I was actually doing hiring, like for administrative staff, I preferred to do kind of in-basket exercises as an assessment, to get at, if they had to use a particular software, I wanted them to actually do something with it, So.
That is a great point. On your screen right now, you see the second one, testing. So here's the 3 categories for pre-screening assessment. Testing. So that's what you're talking about. We would do that too, like a Microsoft Word. If we had a job where someone's going to have to use Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel all day, every day, then absolutely it's fair to ask them to demonstrate that they can, create a pivot table in Microsoft Excel, or, something a little bit more advanced than what just a, ordinary, lay person would use Microsoft Excel for. Also short answer. So for example, if you were asking a recruiter a pre-screening assessment, you might ask them about assessments. You might assess their assessments. So you might ask them a short answer question, like something like, describe the kind of assessments you've used to evaluate candidate skills during screening and interviewing process. You could do a little test, and you can ask them for a work sample. So if you're going to have to write job postings, okay, well, show us a job posting that you've written before. But again, these are designed to not take up a super amount of time. So that part will come later when we go a little bit more in depth into their, testing their ability to do the job. But up front, we want to keep these short and easy. So for these, for the screening guide, so let's actually try doing this. So for going back to the spreadsheet, so now we are on the hiring template. Let me share a bigger chunk of this here. Okay, so here we are. So we're on line 30 of the spreadsheet. So you see screening and pre-screening creation template. So this is, and again, at the end of the session, I'm going to give you a blank version of this because you might be able to actually use this. Those of you working in HR, you might actually be able to use this template. So you would want one that doesn't already have these 5 competencies in it, because these are the competencies for recruiter. So now I'm going to show you the version that I've filled out already. So any thoughts on this? So the 2 that I picked for pre-screening are ones that are hard, medium or hard to discern from the resume. So for example, interviewing and assessment. It's kind of hard for me to figure out whether a candidate is good at interviewing and assessing candidates based on what is on a resume. If anyone feels different, feel free to jump in. So I ranked that one as hard. Based on a resume, it's hard to tell if someone's good at that. Also, interpersonal skills. I mean, it's really hard to tell if someone has really good interpersonal skills from a resume, right? I mean, you could probably figure that out in an interview. But if this is the number 3 competency, maybe I want to know a little sooner, you know, before the interview, that they at least have some basic interpersonal skills. So I'm going to say that one's medium or hard. Same thing with writing. I mean, if the resume is well written, you know, that's a good, you know, indication that they're a good writer. But I want to see actual samples of the actual job. So what I've done here is I've basically taken my 5 competencies and I've decided which of these competencies I want to pre-screen for. So this complements the resume. So I'm going to look at the resume, but then I'm also going to ask them to do 2 pre-screening assessments. Number 1 is a question. So I'm going to ask them a short answer question. Describe what kind of assessments you've used to evaluate people. The other pre-screening assessment I'm going to use, please give me a writing sample of a recent job posting that you've written. So this is pre-screening to complement what we see on the resume. Okay, moving forward in the process now, we're halfway through and we're perfectly on time with the presentation today. Thanks so much, you guys, for being super engaged in this. I really appreciate the conversations that we're having. So let's talk about conversations now, meaning specifically interviewing. So give me some examples of interview questions that you'd love to hate. What are the, and I know what one of them is. I know somebody's going to say it. What are your dreaded interview questions? The questions we love to hate. You can put it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself. Lauren says, tell me about yourself. Yeah, that is a bad one. There's some serious bias there. We're gonna talk about that. Anyone else have an interview question they absolutely hate?
What's your weakness?
Tell me about one of your weaknesses.
Oh, the weakness. Oh yeah, I'm a workaholic, Scott.
Yep.
Did I hear Sally? I heard someone else. Was it Sally?
Same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. What's your greatest weakness? Yeah. Oh, I'm a workaholic. Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, and why do we use these questions? I mean, if we make fun of them, you know, if they're so hated, why do we still use them? And it goes back to that thing that we were talking about earlier about fit. You know, traditionally interviews are used to assess culture fit. But the problem with that is that you end up hiring people that just seem like they're going to fit in and they're going to be liked, instead of people that actually have the qualifications that we need, right? So we need to switch to a skills-based approach to validate skills mastery. And we need to, so we've got some tips and tricks for doing this. So first of all, when we do skills-based interviewing, we're going to focus on competencies. And here's a tip: 1 competency per single question. So the questions that have always boggled my mind in interviews are the ones that are like multi-part, like, you know, this and then also this, and it's too much. It's too much. We need to focus on 1 competency per question in interviewing. We can do assessments, skills assessments to complement that, what we call work assignments and other assessments to validate skill sets. But instead of the point is, instead of focusing on culture fit, we should look at this as culture add. So this is what Sam and I were talking about earlier. How does the diverse background of a candidate bring something new to the organization? Instead of trying to fit into a cookie cutter or, some existing cultural norms, why don't we look at people different from us as being something that enriches our culture instead of being not a part of it? So what we want to do is we want to leverage behavioral and situational questions. Now, I know the folks in HR that are on this call, you already know behavioral interviewing. You probably already do it. That focuses on specific behaviors in the past, asking candidates to show how they've demonstrated a competency before. So for example, like, tell me about a time, those questions that start out like that. Tell me about a time. So we should use behavioral questions. Tell me about a time. Then the other one's situational. That is more like a hypothetical. So that is more like, what would you do, right? So those are the common starts to those questions. Tell me about a time for behavioral, or what would you do for situational? Again, we want to focus on a specific competency, and that's what the exercise we're about to do is going to help us zero in, like a laser, hone in on one specific competency in an interview question. And then again, avoid multiple part questions that attempt to evaluate more than one competency. These are really difficult for a candidate to answer on the fly and difficult for an interview to evaluate as well. And finally, we want to be inclusive and reduce bias. Like Lauren said with the tell me about yourself, questions that directly or even indirectly ask about someone's personal life and their interests. That is the most common way that bias creeps in to the interview process. So you guys can, let's look at a couple and you tell me if these are skills-based or not. Now, if you know how to annotate on a screen, you can annotate it, but you can also, again, this is super informal. You can also just unmute or just put it in the chat. So let's look at some and tell me, is this skills-based or not? So what do you enjoy doing in your spare time? Skills-based or not skills-based?
Not skills-based?
Yes, that is not skills-based. So the reason is it's not behavioral. It's not a behavioral question. It's not a situational question. It's not even asking about a competency. So this is a highly biased, exclusive.
It's not really asking about anything related to work at all.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's not asking about a competency and not even asking about anything about work at all. Absolutely true. Okay, let's try a different one. Tell me about a time in which you had a difficult time filling a role. How did you adapt your recruitment techniques to better attract candidates for that position? What do you think? Skills-based question or not a skills-based question?
Skills-based.
Yeah, definitely. And do you know what do you remember the 5 required competencies for recruiter? One of them is process improvement, right? So we are zeroing in on that competency, the competency of process improvement. This is a very specific example, and this is behavioral, right? Because it's tell me about a time. So you're asking them to demonstrate that they've done this before and explain how they did it. So that is a very strong behavioral question focused on the competency of process improvement. Absolutely. Okay, I got one more. Are you familiar with employment law and how to write effective interview questions and job postings? Skills-based or not skills-based?
Sounds skills-based, but familiar with. Yeah.
I think it's skills-based, but it's got 2 different questions in there.
Right. Okay. So we got a number of problems here. So it's This is not a skills-based question, but you might think it is because it is touching on a competency, one of our preferred competencies, which is familiarity with employment law. But that one is a preferred competency, not a required competency.
Oh, okay.
Because we can teach that. Like, I didn't know anything about employment law before I got into HR, but they provided me with some training on that. So that's an occupational skill. So that would be a hard skill, not a soft skill. We now call it occupational instead of hard. But we can teach that. And also the other problem with this is that it's a yes or no question. And I can tell you from my previous life in public media, you want to always avoid yes or no questions, especially in an interview, because if you ask a yes or no question, you might just get a yes or no answer. And that answer gives very little actual information. So you would want to come up with a situational or behavioral rewrite on this question. So give an example and ask them how they would handle it, or tell me about a time when you had to interpret employment law. Tell me about a time that you had to write interview questions. We could also use work samples for that. And yes, finally, as was pointed out, there's more than one competency discussed in this question too. Writing effectively and employment law, those are two separate competencies. So this is a mixed message question. It's a yes or no question. It's not asking to demonstrate an actual skill. It's just asking about familiarity, which is really not enough. All right, so good exercise. So now let's practice writing some interview questions. So we're going to go back to the spreadsheet again, and we're going to ask, remember, situational is what would you do if, behavioral is tell me about a time when. So let me get out of my slideshow here and go back to the spreadsheet, and let's see if we can come up with just one. Let's see if we can come up with just one. So let's pick one of these. So I'm on line 44 of the spreadsheet. So first, let's pick one. We should probably focus on required right now. So out of these 5, would you guys like to pick one that we can write a question for?
I like process improvement.
Okay, let's do process improvement then. So for the question of process improvement, what is a behavioral or a situational question that we could ask? So behavioral, tell me about a time. Situational, what would you do if? Would anybody like to suggest a possible question to assess this competency? We want to find out if they have had to improve a process before. Or what would they do to improve a process, a hypothetical situation that we give them?
Like what would you do if a recruitment strategy for a specific job was not pulling in sufficient candidates or something?
Okay. What would you do if a recruitment process wasn't working, basically, right? Oh, let me left justify that so that shows up. Okay, Scott, were you going to say something? We got it. That's a situational one.
Tell me about a time when you had to change the way you did something.
Okay.
In order to get a better result. And that's sort of a generic question, but.
Yeah. Tell me about a time you had to change something. Got it. Got it. Okay, let me show you. I worked on this a little bit before. Let's see what I came up with. So here now on your screen, I'm going to show you, I went ahead and answered all of I went ahead and wrote questions for all of these. And you notice we skipped step 3 on what round of the interview. We could decide that later. That could be an internal discussion that you have. So for process improvement, yeah, I absolutely went with something very similar to what you guys came up with. Tell me about a time. So I try to mix behavioral and situational. So there's hypotheticals and hard examples. Tell me about a time in which you had a more difficult time filling a role. How did you adapt your recruitment techniques to better attract candidates for the position? So you're absolutely very specifically asking about process improvement and only about process improvement.
I have a question though, when you're that specific. So the guy who has really never been a recruiter, he has process improvement skills, but his role was never to recruit people.
Ah, okay.
So, I mean, do you make it more generic process improvement or what?
Good point. Good point. Okay, so what we're pointing out here is that the specifics of the question, the behavior is limited specifically to recruitment techniques, not necessarily.
Which is why I said something. Tell me about a time you had to change something because it wasn't working.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe
That could be anything.
Right. So maybe we can improve this question by making it a little bit more generic to process improvement rather than recruitment process improvement. So what's another one here that I wanted to show you guys? Tell me about a time. We have lots of tell me about a time. Let's look at a situational one. So this is a hypothetical. So in this role, you'll be responsible for preparing interview guides for hiring managers. How would you approach designing an interview guide for a new position at a company? So this maybe gets to your point, Sally, about some of the questions being too specific, too narrow. These situational ones, these hypotheticals, we need to make sure that we have a good mix of those in so that candidates that don't have that specific experience can give a solid answer to this, because those situationals ask them how they would handle a situation, not necessarily how they've handled a specific situation before. So we can help mitigate that issue a little bit, in addition to changing the questions themselves, by just making sure that there's some situational questions in there. So how would you do something? So give them a hypothetical and say, how would you do this? Okay, awesome. Great discussion. Let me go back to my spreadsheet, or to my PowerPoint, and see where we are. I think we are doing great. Just trying to find where we left off here. There we go. So now we're going to go to the final stage. So this is the final part of the presentation for today, of our discussion for today, which is work assignments. So interview questions have their limitations. Skills-based interview questions is definitely better than evaluating for fit. But all interview questions still depend on the candidate's ability to talk about their competencies. Some people just aren't good at that. So work assignments go beyond the conversation, and they ask them to demonstrate their competencies. So here's a situation, a simulation that simulates what you're going to do on the job. So for that reason, work assignments usually happen near the end of the hiring process. So unlike pre-screening assessments, these can be longer and a little bit more involved, because at this point we've done our interviews and we've narrowed it down to, let's say, the top 10%, right? Maybe we have 5 candidates left for this recruiter position. So now we're going to start shifting from the required competencies, because at this point, all 5 candidates have them. Now we're going to start shifting to the preferred competencies. So we're going to start screening in instead of screening out. So on the left side of this slide, you see that the view of competencies in practice, that's what we're looking for. So show, don't tell, right? We want some insight into how the candidate will actually perform using a specific competency. Again, usually happens during or after the final interview, as we're evaluating the cream of the crop, the top candidates, and they usually take longer. I mean, it might take 30 minutes to do a typical work assignment. Maybe you let them take it home, and do it from home. It's important to do these though, because these are going to reduce bias by eliminating those socioeconomic biases that we talked about already that tend to plague interview processes. And we're going to evaluate work product to see work outcome. And we are going to compare candidates' performances by giving them all the same scenario and then evaluate them side by side based on specific criteria, which, by the way, we will get into in the next workshop, where we'll create some rubrics and ways to score evaluations that are fair and unbiased. So some work examples. So for a recruiter, let's finish today by talking about what kind of work assignment we could use to distinguish between top candidates for a recruiter. So let's pick a preferred competency. Let's try persuasion. Persuasion. So that is one of those 3 preferred competencies. So again, at this point, our top 5 candidates all have the 5 required competencies. Now we want to screen for preferred competencies. So we want to come up with a task that they would routinely do. So this is where we would go back to that job description, which we've already written to be competency-based. I want to say this is on page 7 of the participant guide. You don't have to pull it up right now, but if you want to look at the job description that we wrote in workshop 1 based on the competencies, that's where it is. So first we need to identify a task that would use this competency. So for example, recruiters will have to write persuasive LinkedIn messages. So this is passive recruiting. So trying to attract candidates who haven't actually applied for the job yet. So maybe for a work assignment example, we would ask them, here's a job description that we're recruiting for. Write us a LinkedIn solicitation. So for those of you who are on LinkedIn, you've probably gotten these before, right? Where you'll get a message on LinkedIn from someone you don't know, and they're like, hey, Bianca, I see that you're doing really great at Fastenal. We've got this great opening over here at LSC. Let me try to convince you to apply for it. Now, unlike the pre-screening assessments and the interview assessments, it's okay if we touch on more than one competency. So for example, if you're talking about persuasion, the form of a task that takes is writing. So you'll see I have highlighted there writing and persuasion. Writing is a required competency for this job. And at this point, we're pretty confident that all 5 of these candidates have that competency. We've demonstrated it in pre-screening assessments, their resume, the interview, all that. We're pretty confident about it, but they're going to show us again in this working assignment that we're going to give them. But the focus is on how persuasive the writing is. So, for example, we can simulate this by giving them a job description and saying, hey, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to write me an email that you would send to a passive applicant, someone who's not actually applied for the job, to persuade them to apply for this job. So this is a great example of a work assignment. So our final exercise to close out, let's see if we can come up with any other work assignments. So let's identify a preferred competency. So I'm going to go back to the spreadsheet. And this will be our final thing for today, the work assignment creation template. So I am on line 65 and I have it shared on my screen here as well. So we need to let's pick a preferred competency. So look at the 3 competencies that we have listed that are preferred, not required, for recruiter, and let's pick one. Maybe one that's difficult to assess during an interview question, because we've already done the interview at this point, right? So what is a preferred competency for recruiter that might be difficult to assess during an interview?
Software.
Okay. Yeah. And here's the example. So here's the example, just to give a little bit more explanation here. Here's the example for persuasion. So you'll see, oh, you know what? Actually, I think I have this on my slide as well. Yes, I do. Okay, so look on my slide here, and in the green arrows is where I have entered new information using this template that we're given. So persuasion can be difficult in an interview to assess how good a person is at persuading, although that's somewhat subjective. I mean, if they're persuading you that they're a good candidate, then they have some persuasion. But can they persuade top candidates online and at job fairs to apply to our positions? I got that directly from the job description, which came directly from workshop 1, where we talked about defining, remember the do something to achieve something, right? That how you define a competency, which is different from identifying the competency. So that we identified the competency as persuasion. We define the competency as what that means in the context of this job. Do something to achieve something. So we define persuasion as persuading candidates online and at job fairs to apply. So what's a common task for that competency? That would be, well, you've got to send these emails. You've got to find candidates on LinkedIn and ask them to apply. So number 4A, you see that last green arrow that I have there. Here is where we define what the work assignment is going to be. Okay, so we're going to give the applicants an overview of a specific position, and we're going to ask them to write a persuasive LinkedIn message as if they were recruiting passive applicants for that position. So it's a simulation. And the rest of this, we can decide this later as an HR team. We don't need to go over it today, like which round in the interview that goes in, what resources you would need, where the location, how much time you're going to give them. We don't have to go over that today. That's kind of getting down into the weeds. But I am going to send you a totally blank version of the spreadsheet that we've been looking at today, so that you can use this for any position that you want. And in fact, a good reason to come back for workshops 3 and 4 is that this isn't the whole thing. There's more coming in workshop 3 and 4. We're going to continue adding to this template that we give you. But I will definitely go ahead and give you the version of the template that we have now. Okay, so to close out, let me go back into presenter mode here. From current slide, presenter view. And let me tighten this up here a little bit. Okay, there we go. So to close out today, recap. So recap is that what we're talking about here is the importance of evaluating competencies. So Sally, Bianca, you guys know those already. KSAs, knowledge, skills, abilities. So really honing our hiring process from the very beginning to creating a job posting and putting it out there, to screening, to then evaluating, onboarding, and retaining. Those last couple ones are what workshops 3 and 4 are all about. So a recap of what we've talked about today: skills-based screening starts with the pre-interview screening, which should focus only on required competencies. When we screen out early in the process, we want to cast the widest net possible. Then moving on to screening those candidates for competencies and moving into interviewing and assessing, we want to make sure that interview questions are unbiased, are not about culture fit, but rather about required competencies, 1 competency per question, and then assessments that clearly show how the competency is used in the role. So throughout this process, we are trying to eliminate points where bias can creep in. So that is basically it for today, guys. I will send you all an invite to workshop 3, which I think might be a little, I think there's going to be more people on 3. There's going to be definitely be a ton of people on 4 because workshop 4 is all about retention. And those of you who are in HR or have been, you know how serious a problem retention is. So the next workshop 103 will probably be in about 3 weeks. Because I don't want to wait too long after this, because it partners so well with the content that we went through today. So taking those best practices that we set up today and using a skills-based approach to judge those applicants, to judge them fairly, and to set them on a path to success with skills-based onboarding. So in the meantime, if you want to learn more about Skillful, they are at skillful.com. I didn't talk too much about this earlier, but this is a new partnership with Next Level Jobs and the Indiana Governor's Workforce Board, where they are basically a nonprofit. The Markle Foundation is the host for Skillful, and they are partnering with workforce development folks like me to help change the way that Indiana hires. If you want more information on the program I work for, Job Connect, you can go to caresource.com/IN for Indiana. And there's a bunch of resources there about our life services program, and in particular, our program Job Connect, where we focus really a 2-pronged approach. My role is partner relations. So I am partner focused. I work with employers, but then most of my team is member facing. They're helping, they're doing the other component of they're coaching individuals on Medicaid to use Indiana Career Connect and to fashion their resumes from a skills-based approach. So there's really 2 sides of this revolution here. There's the employer side and the workforce development side, but there's also the applicant side. And I know, Sally, I know at Work One, you guys do a ton of this type of stuff, helping individuals, craft more targeted and accurate resumes. So we appreciate greatly the work that you guys do. So that is basically it for today. We are ending a little bit early. So thank you for your time. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, feel free to share it now, or you can send me an email later, or anything else. I would love some feedback on this. Thank you for being my guinea pigs. This is the first time that we are doing this. I've never presented this material before. Like I said, it really resonates with me because I feel that I am a product of a skills-based approach. But I'm still learning. And so I really appreciate having this small group to kind of test run this on. And I will continue to refine this and improve upon this. And then hopefully I will take this to all 200 of our employer partners that we work with in Job Connect. Many of whom also, and Bianca, you are an employer partner in that 200. So thank you. Sally, we have met and connected with so many employer partners thanks to the great work that you do, getting the word out about opportunities at local employers. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. And I appreciate what you do every day.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you, Chad.
Have a great rest of your day, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hi, thank you.